Our speaker this morning is Patrick McMillan, who lives in nearby Apex. I first became aware of Patrick about 15 years ago when his TV show, which he hosted and produced called Expeditions with Patrick McMillan, began being broadcast on PBS stations here in North Carolina. The program was actually produced in South Carolina Educational Television at Clemson University, where he was, at that time, a professor of environmental sustainability. The expedition programs went on to earn Emmy Awards, and it's still available, by the way, on streaming, at least it is here in North Carolina. The topic of his expeditions program included such items as environmental issues, biodiversity, cultural and natural resources, initially here in North Carolina, then it spread out across the country to other parts of the United States. And as I mentioned, they won an Emmy Award. I got to actually meet Patrick for the first time when NARGS, the Piedmont chapter of NARGS, hosted a national meeting in Asheville in 2013. And he was an after-dinner speaker that night, and so we got a chance to meet him for the first time. Patrick has a BS degree in biology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he has a PhD in biological sciences from Clemson University. He has a varied work background, including a consultant, served on numerous environmental and conservation committees, native plant societies, including the South Carolina Natural Heritage Trust, as well as being director of the 300-acre South Carolina Botanical Garden at Clemson University. Most recently, Patrick was a director of Heronswood Garden in Kinston, Washington, the garden that was founded by Dan Hinckley and his partner, Robert Jones. He has currently moved back to North Carolina, where he is director of horticulture and gardens at Tony Avent's Plant Delights Nursery and Juniper Level Botanic Garden. And he is also the author of a brand new book, just being published next week, on wildflowers of South Carolina, and it's really worth it. I'll let you get a little hint by looking at the pictures in here. My copy came from Amazon this week, so get your copy before they sell out. But he's here today to talk to us on the topic of creating a natural community garden with Southeastern native plants. Please welcome Dr. Patrick McMillan.
Glad you got your book. I'm glad they sent you your book.
Yeah.
Early, yeah. Yeah, they did. They published early. So even though the date of, I think we're supposed to come out on the 25th, they're fully stocked in all the warehouses. So if you want to learn more about natural communities, not to plug myself, but I'm plugging myself. But it is a really great book because the book is arranged with by natural community. And there's tons of information here totally applicable to North Carolina. I think there's maybe it's less than 20 plants in there that don't also overlap with North Carolina in one way or the other. And all of them overlap with our gardening desire, right? So neat book from that standpoint. And all of the proceeds from this book go to support the garden that we'll be spending a lot of time talking about today, which is the Natural Heritage Garden at the South Carolina Botanic Garden and Botanical Garden. Now that I work at a botanic garden, it's hard to go back to saying botanical, in Clemson, South Carolina. So we're going to start. This is a little different type of talk than a lot I've done for the societies in this part of the world, though it's my favorite kind of talk to do, because it's not just a list of plants. In fact, it's not a list of plants. It's kind of a challenging and confrontational idea to abandon some of our sacred, long-held traditions as gardeners bent in the image of our past in Western Europe and bent on the image and the traditions of colonialism, and start to go back to truly embracing all of our indigenous roots when it comes to gardening. Now, the one thing that I'm revered and hated by native plant societies for doing is what I'm going to do right now, which means when I say going back to your indigenous roots does not mean you can't plant Japanese, Chinese, Mexican, Brazilian, or plants from Mars in your garden. Okay, absolutely. What I'm talking about is our indigenous, and each of us comes from a background that has a tradition and an indigenous actual relationship with the world, right? And truly, as I've matured and as I've grown as not just a horticulturist, but also as a conservation scientist and as an ecologist, every day, it seems I find more and more of the problems that we see environmentally in the world are us being removed from our indigenous traditional relationship with the land, right? So this talk really is about that and about how an experiment we did in South Carolina really went a ways to start to change our ideas in the Southeast of what a garden can look like and how full a garden can be. All right, so the asteroid's coming for Earth. You have one day, only one day. You're all by yourself. You have no family, friends around. You're all by yourself. You have one day to go somewhere in the world that means the most to you, okay? So my first slide is this. Close your eyes and see that place. What does that place look like to you? Okay. So for some of us, that place looks like this. Okay. Grandeur of views, you know, Mount Rainier, which I was blessed enough to be able to wake up to seeing this out my window from a little farther away, but, you know, out our window over Puget Sound every morning. So for some of us, it looks like that. For others, it may look like this. This is one of my places. This is the coast, 10th region of Chile, with Lobelia tupa, you know, punctuating the foreground. I can hear the hummingbirds around. I can see the beautiful basaltic coastline that I grew to love so much and it brought me so much peace. For others, it might look like this. For others, it might be a view across the swath of the Great Plains, the prairie with balsam root in the foreground. For some of us, it may be a place like this that's fascinating because of all of the incredible structure and complex form that, that the elements of this habitat have and that the feeling of that habitat has. When I look at that, I can feel the steam rising up off of the wet savanna soil in the morning. I can feel and hear the cicadas calling from the pine trees. I can hear in my mind the chatter of the woodpeckers, of the red-cockaded woodpeckers and the brown nuthatches around me. I mean, there's a whole experience there. But for me, this is my place. Out of all places in the world, whenever crap hit the fan for me, I found myself sitting on that rock next to that ancient, yet only 4 foot tall Table Mountain pine that's been reaching out over that beautiful mountain gorge in the Appalachian Mountains, very close to where my wife and I grew up, about 8 miles from my house. I used to walk there back and forth from my house when I was a kid. And every time I go here, I go there, I sort of meditate and I leave behind this exoskeleton of all the things that are bothering me, and I'm able to get up and walk away refreshed. And just in case you think my place only looks like this, when I turn my head around, it looks like this. Okay, so that's right at my back. So it's a place that you know, combines all those things that I think of as the perfection of the world around us, which in many cases is also imperfection. Because the thing I'm drawn to most is that scraggly little pine that's leaning out over the gorge. And it's been barely surviving since I'm 6 years old. And I've been going there for almost 50 years, and it's looked exactly the same. And I don't think we've ever missed a year of going and visiting with this pine and this place that is just really special to me. So, you know, your place may look like that, but did any of you think about this as being the place that you would want to spend your last hours? Did anybody have that in their mind? No. So why the hell do we surround ourselves with this? It makes no sense. It makes no sense on a biological level, makes no sense on an environmental level, and it makes absolutely no sense from a human spiritual level to try to envelop the world into a controlled little round blob surrounded by a sea of mulch. especially the laurel petalum. Jeez whiz, it was cool for the first 6 weeks we had it. And then, you know, it's like, all right, whatever, it's another laurel petalum. But yeah, but, you know, the thing that you come to realize is no matter that I do, and, you know, everybody has their own view on what they like, and I'm supportive of whatever you like in your garden, because your garden should be about you, right? And that's the important part. But for me, a garden is a place where we realize those indigenous traditional relationships with the soil, with the land, and with the world. And this isn't my indigenous relationship with the soil. This brings me nothing except maybe pleasing the HOA. You know, it doesn't do it for me. It wouldn't do it for me if it was a bed of Rudbeckia fulgida that they said, oh, well, there's only a native plant covenant here. You got to, well, I'm going to plant a Rudbeckia fulgida that's not actually native to this part of South Carolina, because I'm going to go out and only be able to find Goldstrom, which isn't even really a Rudbeckia fulgida, and then plant it, and then maybe the native plant people will be happy. But it's still a ball isolated by a bunch of other things under control. The idea that we're controlled, that we're somehow masters by encapsulating diversity in our yards and preventing interrelationships. It's not surprising we do this. You know, this is a fine little orangery at Versailles, sort of the pinnacle of some of the problematic things about colonialism. You know, this is the way the world, that we tend to think of the world when it comes to what the HOA demands, right? We want it boxed up, we want it very easy to control, and we want it separated. That's the idea of being able to go out into the world, grab what you want, what makes your neighbors envious, what makes other people in the NARGS envious, bring it back home, set it in a spot, keep it all to itself, have total control over its reproduction, its spread, everything else, and that's the way we tend to garden. And it is. And it's particularly been that model in the Southeast. That's why I think it's so important for people to travel. You know, we may have inherited this from our Western European connections and for some of us ancestors. But if you go back there, nobody's doing this anymore. Go to Great Dixter. Challenge you to find anything that looks like that at Great Dixter. Find anything that looks like a backyard in Cary, Apex, Raleigh. Well, there's some people in here who have backyards that look like Great Dixter, but you know, it's challenging to find a garden these days that's not just simply representing the heart of the colonial past like Versailles, that's arranged in a way where nature is under such control. You know, for us, for my family, when we chose to get married, we get married here on a rock in the middle of Thompson River in the Jocassee Gorges because it was meaningful to us, right? It's a place where on one side of this rock, you have a fern that normally grows in South America and nowhere else in the United States. And on another side of the rock, you got a fern that normally grows in spruce fir forests, high altitudes in Canada, able to survive at low elevations because of the nurturing nature of the gorge. So for me, I look at the world and I transport everything into my own idea of spirituality, my own idea of what something symbolically means to me, right? And I think that's what gardens are too. So we treat everything as a garden. And you're going to find out today, there is no place in the green world that's not a garden. That sometimes shocks people too. There's no place that's not a garden. I don't care where you go. Everywhere on this earth has a connection to our traditional indigenous relationship with the land. So our goal, very early on, I inherited in 2010. John Kelly, who was vice president of Clemson, he was the PSA, basically the outreach or the extension arm of the university leader, brings me into his office, and I'm already doing 3 or 4 jobs for Clemson, have 3 or 4 titles, and he says, "How would you like to be the director of the South Carolina Botanical Garden?" I said, "No, not at all." You know what I'm doing, John? He says, "Oh, I guess I'm going to have to shut it down then." I'm like, "Oh, Jesus." I said, "What does this job pay?" "It pays nothing." "Oh, I'll take it." So I inherit this garden at the height of the economic downturn. We had a budget of $10,000 a year. I had 2 gardeners for 295 acres. 2 gardeners one office person who was also in charge of everything else, one educator, right? And one guy who fixed the vehicles, did all the maintenance stuff, who was currently deployed because he was at that time deployed because he was Army Reserve. So you talk about coming into a mess. And John Kelly says, now, I know you're going to do a good job of this, Patrick, but I just want to give you a goal. Within 5 years, I want you to be regionally, nationally, and internationally recognized. With no money, right? So I'm banging my head against the wall, and I'm like, what am I going to do here? The garden was an incredible arboretum, essentially, collection of trees and woody plants, but had almost no herbaceous component, no developed walkways, not a single paved, brick paved trail, nothing. And I'm like, so what do I do here? How do I weave this all together? And, I kind of had that aha moment when I gave a talk about the garden very early on in my directorship there. And I was like, I don't know what I'm going to talk about this place. It's a problem. And at the end of the talk, one of the ladies from the Charleston Garden Club said, you know what the problem with the South Carolina Botanical Garden? And I said, yeah, I hear it from everybody. I know all the problems. There's nothing but problems. And she said, it doesn't represent South Carolina. Now, Betty was not telling me, hey, it doesn't represent the natural parts of South Carolina. She was saying, y'all don't have camellias and Spanish moss and live oaks up there, so it just doesn't represent Charleston. Because in South Carolina, the South Carolinians have a 11th commandment. It's like, or for the creation story, on the sixth day God created Charleston, and that was the center of the universe. So anyway, I set out on this project, and it was really just my son and I at the beginning to build a true representation of South Carolina that represented my belief system of maybe what a garden could do. What is possible in a garden? Because lots of native plant gardens exist. Lots of people had attempted small portions of this, but what I wanted to do was not take a bunch of plants from the mountains, the Piedmont, and the coast and put them in the garden. I wanted to bring the coast to the mountains of South Carolina, put it in the garden. I wanted to bring the cove forests and put them into the garden in all the things they did, all the interconnections, not just manipulate my landscape to make it look like that, but to actually manipulate the landscape and control it using the powers that we have as horticulturists to provide the things that allowed not just a plant, but a natural community to grow in the garden. So, spoiler alert, we did it, from the mountains to the sea. We were able to do everything from maritime forests, shell-midden thickets, longleaf pine savannas, sand hills, Piedmont prairies, cove forests, the whole 9 yards. If you haven't seen it, I assume it's still in pretty good shape. I think it is. I've been gone for a couple years, but, I'm sure they know what they're doing. So, to understand this, we need to start to talk about what the difference is between a natural community and a garden, okay? So what is the difference between a natural community and a garden, okay? Well, I would say that a natural community, I would define a natural community as a recurring interactive assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them, okay? So this includes everything. Climate, okay, is one of those big things. What determines where a plant can live? A lot of people look at averages when they talk about weather. They say, oh, well, what's the average? Okay, well, the average annual temperature in Asheville, North Carolina is 57 degrees. The average annual temperature in San Francisco is 57 degrees. You can grow Canary Island date palms and jacarandas in San Francisco, but not in Biltmore, right? It's the extremes that determine where plants can grow climatically. Now, we're super lucky in the Southeast. We have a fairly mild winter, okay, which allows us a lot of flexibility. You guys know this because you grow an amazing diversity of plants from all over the warmer parts of the world. But it's not just the climate, okay, that impacts them. It's also, what's the geology? What are the soils like? What's the hydrology like? What are the interconnections and interactions that drive that natural community between the living things, the non-living things, and most importantly, what are the ecosystem processes? Like fire. And this is what creates fire, is human hand, okay? Wherever you go in the fire-maintained world, you'll see fires do start from lightning strike, etc., but not with the frequency that's required to create what we call the natural communities that are dependent on fire. So in a garden, we do all this. okay? But we limit the interactive assemblage. The only thing we're doing different in most traditional gardens is limiting the interaction of our plants, the natural environment and our plants, and the living things, and our indigenous traditional relationship with the soil. So this picture I chose to put this slide on is a tallgrass prairie. Beautiful, isn't it? It is a functioning natural community on the Elbe River at the Loki-Schmidt-Garten in Hamburg, Germany. It's still a natural community in my mind, because this is a garden that has been designed by people, right? The whole world designed by people, maintained by people, but maintained through editing at this point rather than through addition and through intentional design. It's sort of after the thought design to make sure that it still is functioning, looking, and maintaining the species we want to have in that natural community, right? Okay, so a garden can be a natural community only if it replicates the geologic edaphic conditions, that's the rock type, the soil type, replicates the moisture level, replicates the community structure and composition, okay, and includes the ecological processes that sustain such a place, right? So in the case of this garden, it's maintained by fire, grazing, or mowing, right? Otherwise, it would be a forest. This is in Allegheny County, North Carolina, right? Otherwise, it would be a forest, and all those processes are applied by human choice. So look at a couple of what we call natural communities. Redwood forest from Northern California. And you got to know the conditions you have to understand the conditions needed in the garden to achieve your goal. So if you have a special place in the world that means the most to you and you want to replicate it in your garden, you can. If you can't, Tony says you're just not a good enough horticulturist. That's what he always tells me and Jeremy anyway. It died, but you got to try again. It's not, you didn't do good enough. You're not a good enough horticulturist if your lithops died, right? So in the case of this natural community, it is maintained by fog. It's maintained by having deep acidic organic soils, and it's maintained by an absence of fire and a moderated climate during all times of the year. Closer to home in the Southern Appalachians. You know, you guys are going to walk out of here being able to go to the mountains next spring, and when you look at a cove, you go up to see the wildflowers, you look at the cove, you're going to be able to say, oh, you know what? The soil pH here is probably around 4.5 down to maybe even 3. Or, oh, this is a circumneutral soil. It has a pH of 6.2 or above. Simply by what I'm going to tell you here. We have two major types of cove forests. Acidic cove forests, acid soil, conifers are important because they don't shed their leaves. They don't drop off those nutrients that are hard to get in acidic soils. We all kind of know soil science at lower pHs. We have a problem with root tip elongation, a problem with aluminum toxicity, and we have a hard time with mobility of the nutrients that plants need, our nitrogen, our phosphorus, our potassium, our calcium, magnesium. All those things are more difficult in very low pH soils. So things tend to be evergreen, where you see evergreen shrubs like rhododendron and mountain laurel growing up in the mountains. That's acidic soil. They're holding on to their leaves because calcium's often limiting in those because it's non-mobile within the plant. And when they dump a leaf off, they have to wait for that leaf to rot, and then they have to struggle to get it from an association with a mycorrhizal fungi that gets it for them. It's hard to get, so you grow slow and you don't shed your leaves. Okay, it's because of the type of rock, things like Henderson gneiss, table rock granite. That's where soil comes from the rock. Those acidic rocks produce acidic soils. You go other places in the mountains, you'll see this. Not a rhododendron in sight, nothing ericaceous in sight. Crazy trees like in this picture, giant yellowwoods and basswoods. And there's also 3 very big butternut trees in this picture. And below them, all deciduous herbs and shrubs and saplings. This is what we call a basic or a rich cove forest. Basic because the soil pH is higher. Higher pH means that the trees can afford to throw away everything they got that year at the end of the year. They can afford to be quick growing, deciduous, and lush because they're living in a rich neighborhood. Okay, so basic coforests host the Paris Hiltons of the world, of the plant world, right? Wear it once and throw it away. Very high herb cover and diversity, and this is where most of the showy wildflowers that we see in the mountains come from. And in our mountains, it's because they come from a rock called amphibolite that breaks down to form the component of the soil that is high in magnesium, and in some cases also high in calcium, which are cations that drive up the availability of nutrients by raising the soil pH. Okay, here's just another one. This is a serpentine barren, Jeffrey Pine serpentine woodland in Oregon. And here, no matter how hard you tried, you wouldn't be able to grow up a bunch of deciduous trees because the calcium to magnesium ratio is so offset in the ultramafic, which just means super high in magnesium soils, that they're nearly toxic to most plants. So the plants that can live there are usually grasses and herbs and pines. Right? So that's maintained by the geology. Out in the Pacific Northwest, camas is very important to the indigenous cultures. It's a food item. It's highly tied to their spiritual meaning as a culture. And so camas is highly valued. And camas meadows are incredibly rare in the Puget Sound area today, but once were very common. And they were common because camas grows on the same soil that the Douglas fir grows on, that the Douglas fir forest grow on. However, those soils, even though they're the same, were torched by people to maintain the open meadow-like community, reduce the woody plants, and they were doing it because they harvested the camas bulbs there, right? The more fire you applied, the more camas, the better off they were. Same with our Southern Appalachian glade system that I love so much. Right? So the interactions, okay, you guys all know about interactions. I'm going to go very quickly through this, but the interactions that we think of when we talk about gardens, because everybody wants to have birds, butterflies, and bees in their garden, right? So pollinators. So we know, oh gosh, you got to plant milkweed if you want monarchs. But there's a lot of others that we ignore that are way more important for supporting the local biodiversity in the Southeast. Things like, here's a great example. This is, what kind of flower is that? What is that blooming? It's a blueberry. And blueberries are pollinated by what? Well, they're not pollinated by this big guy that's coming in. That is a carpenter bee. And the carpenter bee is coming in to chew a hole through the flower and rob the plant of nectar and pollen without pollinating the plant. What they're pollinated by is that little look-alike with a very long, narrow face that's able to get into those ursulate, sort of bell-shaped corollas of the blueberry, and in the process pollinate the plant. Southeastern blueberry bees are the primary pollinator that actually affects the sexual reproduction in blueberries, right? Turtle heads, you guys all grow turtle heads in your garden. Cologne, look like a little turtle. You can squeeze the sides and make them talk like a little cartoon creature if you play with your plants like I do. And they're made exactly to fit our native common bumblebee, right? Not a carpenter bee. They're made to fit a little common bumblebee, right? And of course, anything red is pollinated by what? By hummingbirds, right? And you can actually get so good at this that you can say, hey, I see that plant you're growing over there. I have no idea what it is, but I can tell you whether it grows in the New World or the Old World, because New World red flowered plants have leaves that have flowers that are held away from the stem and the leaves. By the way, this fastest video that's ever been shot of hummingbirds, that's a drop of water falling past its tail. The longest of these clips is about 1/200th of a second long. So this stuff is happening very quick. Hummingbirds can hover because of the way they flap their wings in a figure-8 shape, okay? And the figure-8 shape creates lift on both the upswing and the downswing. They're the only birds in the world that can do that. They're the only birds that can fly upside down and backwards. And if you really want to see it, you need to get a $2,500 a day rental camera and a national TV show that has a budget to support it. But it's really fascinating to see, isn't it? And so we know that these structures like red tubular flowers that are held away from leaves are developed, co-evolved with our hummingbirds, okay? So when we look at our lilies of the field here, Sandhills lily, endemic to the Carolinas and Georgia and Virginia. in the sandhills where it grows in wet seeps, has red flowers way out away from the foliage. And this incredible shot by my friend Will Stewart, which is in the book. I don't know how long he had to wait to get that picture, but illustrates exactly what we're talking about, those interconnections. Without the hummingbird, the plant doesn't have successful reproduction. Plants that have petals that are bent backwards like this, look at the bumblebee there. The female bumblebee is going to land on the bottom of that flower of the primula. Yeah, I said primula. Dodecathion. Now it's primula. I refuse. It's dodecathion, right? I can't remember if we used primula in the book or not, but it grabs a hold of the base of those stamens. And when we look at those stamens, they're tubular, they're hollow, the pollen's on the inside. And only by creating a buzz, by vibrating her thorax against her abdomen at 30 times per second, will it cause just the right frequency to shoot the pollen out the end of those tubes. And the amazing part about learning about these interconnections is that plants in the primrose family, like dodecathion, have flowers that look like this, but not all the primrose family plants have flowers like this. Plants in the solanaceae, completely unrelated, in the tomato family, like tomatoes, have the same type flowers. Still the same interconnection. We call those pollinator syndromes. So how do we support those interconnections? Okay, well, the article that I wrote kind of has exactly what I'm going to be talking about today. Number one, minimize your turf. There is a reason for turf, okay? People need a place to walk. You need a place to visit with your children, your grandchildren. You need a place where you can do that. Turf is a great idea for that. But turf should be a minuscule part of your landscape if you really are concerned about producing a natural community, because turf does nothing that wildlife need, nothing. And to see the difference, go to a weedy roadside and listen to the buzz of the crickets and the bees and everything that's going on, and then go to your yard and see what you hear. Nothing, right? Because life doesn't use non-diverse monocultures. Include as much diversity as you can when you're planting. This is not in the wild. This is in the garden. This is a natural community created at the South Carolina Botanical Garden of a longleaf pine wetland savanna. And all the diversity, there's 470 species just in our wetland savanna exhibit at the South Carolina Botanical Garden, all growing together and only edited, no longer needing addition, subtraction only. We use in this to maintain the plants that we have, okay? Why do we want all the diversity? Why do we need numbers? You want as many plants as you can of as many different kinds as you can, okay? Why? Well, it goes back to some basic science, and this is not to scale, because if it was, the top parts would be so tiny you couldn't see them, okay? The more primary producers, things that achieve their production of energy from sunlight that you have, right, the more herbivores that you can grow. And herbivores aren't only deer, right, and rabbits that we all hate. They're also the caterpillars, right, that feed on the oak trees, that are a reason that so many neotropical migrants make the journey all the way from South America to North Carolina to raise their young. There are also things like rice rats and cotton rats that form the basis of the food system for things like bald eagles, barn owls, those kind of things. The caterpillars feeding the birds and the frogs, right? These birds and frogs are the secondary consumers. So if you don't have a ton of these, you can have very few of these, which means you have none of those. And it takes so many that on this graph, there wouldn't even be a little dot at the top for how many hawks and apex predators can be produced in that one unit of space, right? So that's why the number of species is very important, and the diversity of species that you have is important, because each one of these things, like caterpillars, is specialized on one thing. The more options you have for specialization, the more diversity you have in your garden, the more of everything you produce. So what can go wrong? Low habitat heterogeneity. All right, that's a big fancy word for you don't have enough of variability in your garden, okay? Low quality species composition. This is easy to do, right? If all you plant are double T roses and lace cap or mop head hydrangeas, then you're putting up statues. because those things don't have anything pollen, nectar-wise, or really leaf-wise to feed anything other than Japanese beetles. Okay? So not saying you can't have those, sure. But what else do you have? What do you have that's actually working for a living? Too tidy. This is the biggest problem that everybody has when they try to build a garden that's a natural community garden. They try to make it too tidy. Limitation of niches within the habitat. And one that sometimes you can't control, poison. Sometimes a neighbor's poison or regional poison to life happens. So like citywide spraying of mosquitoes before dark in Greenville, South Carolina keeps one of the best gardens I ever designed from having any pollinators, because every week they're coming through and they're killing off whatever tried to come into the garden. So those are problems we don't control in our own landscape. But if you do it, you can eventually get there. All right, let's talk about these very quickly. The habitat heterogeneity is important. If you want to see something, because, you know, to me, a garden is not just the plants, it's the sound. It's every one of my senses. I want the sight, I want the sound, I want the taste, I want the smell. We design gardens for all those things if they're truly reaching us spiritually as a human being. Right? So habitat heterogeneity is really important for that. If you love blue grosbeaks, but all you have is a dense shade garden, you're never going to have a blue grosbeak, because they like nasty old clear cuts and regenerating forests and shrubby places, right? It's edge habitat, right? We take a look from where I just moved from, picture from right near our house here. In old growth Pacific Northwest forest, which everybody thought, oh, it's so, you know, it's so natural, it's so beautiful because it hasn't been burned in a long time. You have the option to see probably 3 species of birds where I took this picture. And you're never going to see the spotted owl. You'll hear the varied thrush, but never see him. And you'll hear the Pacific wren, but you'll never see him, right? Whereas if I go to the edge of the same place, on the edge of an open habitat, this edge habitat, I see this whole long list of beautiful birds. Birds tend to be, the highest numbers of birds tend to be in productive edge habitats where the grassland, the forest, and the edge all work together to bring all the specialists together and produce lots and lots of productivity. Okay? It means productivity is the amount of food basically you're producing, the amount of biomass you're producing per unit area. If your idea is creating diversity, is this wonderful idea in scientific ecological theory called the intermediate disturbance theory of diversity maintenance. And what it says basically, and it can be applied to disturbance, it can be applied to soil nutrients, it can be applied to anything. The more extreme on either end you have, the less diversity you'll maintain, okay? You can think about this in political terms. Right? It's the same for everything. The more extreme your opinion, the less diversity that you'll be able to maintain within your natural society that you're creating in your garden. So if we're using, for instance, fire, if fire returns every couple years to this habitat, then we maintain those things that need infrequent fire and those things that need frequent fire, and we're removing competition from either end in the middle, right? So we need to think about our gardens in the same way, because a good friend of mine, Sam Fuhlendorf, who was my son's professor for his PhD, looked at this in research. After a fire, the species of birds and how they change, this research done in Oklahoma, but applicable here too. Natural communities are dynamic. They don't stay the same. Your garden shouldn't stay the same. They don't, do they? They change over time. It's hard to keep nature static, okay? So a vast diversity as a base. Do I consider these natural community gardens? Yes. Just because it's got a hedge doesn't mean it's not providing all the things that I just talked about. And this is Heronswood. It has lots of edge. It is filled from end to end with life. Is this a natural community garden? Yeah. South Carolina Botanical Garden. So the crazy thing is we had actually more insect diversity in our Chihuahuan garden than we did in any of our natural community gardens from South Carolina. Because these plants from the Chihuahuan Desert ecoregion flower when it's after a rain in the Chihuahuan Desert, and we get rain intermittently throughout the year here, which means they flower all the time, which means that the insects just went bonkers. when we did a Chihuahuan Desert Natural Community Garden. But in this garden, you'll notice we didn't just plant the Bignolina nelsoni, the yuccas, the cactus, and the agaves. We have thorn scrubs in there. We have the grasses in there. We have the annuals in there. We have all of the biodiversity that occurs in the Chihuahuan Desert ecoregion in that garden, arranged the way that they are arranged in nature, right? It's immersive. Our idea at the South Carolina Botanical Garden was we wanted people to see and feel and hear what it's like to be in the Davis Mountains of West Texas, right? We want to fill the landscape with plants that work for a living, okay? This means avoid the doubles. The double-flowered things don't, you can have them. They're awesome. They're beautiful. They're great accent plants. Put them in your landscape. But the whole landscape shouldn't be mophead hydrangeas. Lace caps support pollinators. Mopheads don't. They only have sterile florets. So you want a big, beautiful lace mophead? Plant 3 lace caps. Maximize the diversity of Asteraceae, Apiaceae, that's the aster family, the carrot family, the milkweed family, the mint family, and the Plantagenaceae, which is the not just the plantain family, but what we used to call the Scrophulariaceae, so the snapdragon family. Those plants produce and support more pollinators than anything else you can, number-wise, than anything else you can bring into your landscape, okay? Leave no empty spaces. Try to fill every space. It's a challenge. Try to fill every space with something that's growing and flowering at all times of the year, and I mean even the winter, because we can do that here, right? Leave no space unoccupied. This is incredible. Dwayne West is one of my horticultural heroes. He's worked at Heronswood for 30-some years. And in the potager garden, which is by far not a natural community garden by the strict sense, it still has everything that a natural community has. And if you look at, I mean, who wouldn't fall in love with that amazing river of Silene regia? But Silene regia, native North American plant, Lobelia syphilitica, native North American plant, Salvia farinacea, and all this Heliopsis, but also with Agapanthus, Cattleya, right? Hedychium, Lychnus. So not truly just native, but who cares? It's supporting, everything there is supporting a pollinator. Everything there is a potential food resource, and the number of insects in that sunny garden bed are greater than anywhere else you go in Heronswood or on the Kitsap Peninsula. Conifers and ferns, a lot of us love them, but they're low productivity. So if you minimize them in your landscape, you maximize the diversity of insects. So interplanting fern collections with things that do flower, things that do die back in the wintertime, is a great way to hold on. I'm a hardy fern fan. I am a fern freaking nut, okay? Like you don't even understand. And I'm the director here of a garden that has the largest hardy fern collection in the world, right? But it's not just ferns. It's all interplanted to make it productive, okay? So nectar and pollen. I just want to give a shout out to beetles, because beetles are like there should be 4 Bs, birds, butterflies, bees, and most importantly, beetles. Because if there was a poster child for all of life on Earth, 2/3 of it are beetles, right? So we think about honeybees, and they're not even native insect. If you give people that plant non-native plants a hard time, you better also get rid of every honeybee, right? Plus the pears and the apples and all the things you're eating, because they're not native. Our native plants support, this is one of the natural pollinators, the flower chafer beetle. And how many even know he exists? But he doesn't just stick his butt in there. Look at this. He's over here pollinating. He's got these fuzzy bellies to hold the pollen. He's pollinating Arnoglossum, longhorns on Spirea. And look at here, even on rhododendron. There he is again, my lovely little flower chafer beetle. Very important. Beetles are unsung heroes in the pollination world. When we're thinking about creating a natural community, we think about the interconnections that not just feed them nectar, but feed the things we want, right? It's the reason why we plant spice bush. It's the reason we plant spice bush is to grow these spice bush swallowtail caterpillars, which turn into beautiful spice bush swallowtail butterflies. Oaks, having oaks in the canopy on your edges is really important. 534 butterfly moth species, 96% of birds raise their young on insects. So if you have an oak tree, oaks support the most diversity of creepy crawly little caterpillars that support the highest numbers of these guys, okay? This is one of the Doug Tallamy studies. And Doug Tallamy and I had a really wonderful time at an event I did in Highlands the other day. And I really loved it because he gets misquoted a lot. Like the thing about pollen, or there was a thing in the New York Times. You had nectar from a butterfly bush is poison to our native pollinators. He never said that. There's no such thing as bad nectar. Butterfly bushes still, butterflies love them. They're eating them. They may be invasive in parts of the country. But essentially, I think we're on the same page when it comes to most of this anyway. Beach blanket flower. Here's a native plant you can plant in your garden that attracts goldfinches. You'd be amazed how much goldfinch rely on the seeds of things like Gaillardia, not just that species, but Estivalis. We sell one called Glitz and Glamour at Plant Delights. It's just incredible, much more reliably perennial in the Raleigh area. And every morning I come in, there's goldfinches hanging out around that patch eating the seeds. Same thing with the coneflowers. But what do we have to do to allow the birds to enjoy the seeds of the coneflower and the Gaillardia?
Leave them alone.
We can't deadhead them. Oh God, really? Oh my God, it's like the one colonial era thing that everybody has such a problem with. I'm not saying don't deadhead don't deadhead anything in your garden. But, if we don't deadhead, then we could have a seed come up. We don't want it to, where we don't want it to come up, okay? Well, when you fill your garden, you're editing out those things. I don't like that there. Okay, pull it out. Would you rather pull out a Glitz and Glamour Gaillardia estivalis, or would you rather spend all year pulling out shotweed and spurge? Right. So fill your area with plants that you want, and pull them where you don't want them is a much better strategy. There are a lot of plants that provide both fruit, nectar, pollen, and food sources for the world. Flatwoods plum, Prunus umbellata, probably the best of all worlds because the genus Prunus supports so many species of caterpillars. And we found over 200 different pollinators on this one tree at the South Carolina Botanical Garden. So if you have a Bradford pear you're trying to replace, that's your thing. Try a Prunus. Try Flatwoods plum. Same color in the spring, but you get the bonus of having very tart fruits that you can make wonderful preserves out of later in the year if you can beat the birds to them. This is another one that people have a hard time with, and it's one that fell apart and seems like every garden in Europe embraces today, which is to allow structural and seasonal interest elements to overlap. And this, I think, is central to what we're talking about, because if my garden is a philosophical representation of me, then my philosophy is that we need to define beauty as the intersections of life, not the divisions. Because seeing Fleischmanni incarnata or Solidago mexicana or Heterotheca subaxillaris as a little ball is not nearly as meaningful as seeing them when they overlap and create this beautiful tapestry. And it's the same with humans, like with people communities. And that's what I think is great about gardens is like when we look at human communities, how much are we really interweaving ourselves? Because the less we interweave ourselves, the more social problems we have. The more people hate people. Same in our garden. The more we rigidly keep things apart, the less they're able to interact and the less life they're able to generate. So again, just a design I did in the Chihuahuan garden, it's not what most people would do. Don't design your gardens if you want to do this as something that has the short plants up front, the mid-sized plants in the middle, and the tall plants back in the back, right? Make a curtain. I mean, God, I put this 6-foot-tall Muhlenbergia Lindheimeri and all of these Dazzlerians right in front of the great big whale-tongue agaves, Agave ovatifolia. And I did it because that's the way nature is. Nature requires you to explore, to work. It doesn't put everything out, painted on short, medium, tall, right? And this also creates intimacy. I don't want people to get stuck by the agaves when they walk the path, but I want them to maybe feel the feathery touches of the Muhlenbergia as they come past. A very non-offensive, intimate relationship with nature, right? course, I guess there's people out there that like the agave up front. I don't know. Just a picture from Plant Delights. Here's Thymophila pentaquita, which is a wonderful ever-blooming species from the Chihuahuan Desert, growing in amongst a Dazzlerian and enveloping it, hugging it, right? All I have to do is keep it from suffocating it and keeping the airflow bad around the base of the stem during the wintertime. But otherwise, I can let that interplay between the Muhlenbergia dumosa, the Thymophila, and the Dazzlerian exist, and what a much richer tapestry we're making, and it's one that exists in nature. Okay, when we plant our shade gardens, making sure that we're creating places like this, right? Where we have not confinement, but movement within our designs creates a much more soothing and spiritually grounding place to look at than if I had just all the Claytonia and the wad over here, the Trillium here, the Phagopteris over here, right? It blends, it works better and stronger as a symphony than it does as little concertos on their own, right? So we use ground covers as living mulch, and this is something we do in the Pacific Northwest in every garden. I don't know why we don't do it in every garden in the Southeast. We need to. We have lots of good ones. But there we'll have, we'll use things like at Heronswood, we use erythronium as an early spring living mulch. And then it's replaced by things like Tiarella as the season progresses, right? So that we're not just extending our flowering diversity in season, but we're changing over time. So I got a hot, dry place in the Southeast or a hot, wet place in the Southeast because frog fruit will go in either one. And again, the roots go down into the soil about an inch. So they're not competing with anything below. It's forming a dense mat. You're not going to get seedlings to come up. You're not going to get weeds to come up. And frog fruit has these gorgeous little verbena-like flowers or lantana-like flowers. And in a mild year, it will produce them 12 months of the year, all year, okay? And beloved by little skipper butterflies too. So you can have your structural plants and your seasonal interest interplanted with them, particularly bulbs. If you like Lycoris, plant the Lycoris within it, does great. We already talked about this, allowing plants to complete the life cycle, meaning even to try and include some dead timber. And what about your leaves that fall in the autumn? You rake them right up when they fall? If you have a public garden and you need to look perfect all the time, maybe you do. But if not, and you really want a natural community garden, a huge percentage of the beetles and the caterpillars that have pupated are in those leaves. When you rake them up, you're destroying their habitat, okay? So it's free mulch. If it's not bothering, don't rake them till spring. If you have dead wood, try to incorporate it in an artful way into your garden, because the dead wood, of course, you know, all these things live in snags. The woodpeckers we like in our yard, my wife and I just loved the flying squirrels we had at our house in Roaring Gap, North Carolina. They were there every single night. We'd have 8, 10 flying squirrels because we had so many snags that they lived in our yard. I don't know if you can hear this. Does this have volume, Tim? Or?
I don't know. Like the volume, it would be coming straight out of the computer.
Okay. So if you could hear, you'd hear all this chiming of insects in that little piece of video. This is a difficult one for us, but it's absolutely essential for providing good habitat, which is embracing a ruderal component, which means weedy. I'm not talking about embracing ragweed and, annual weeds and spurge. I'm talking about embracing things like goldenrods, asters, perennial grasses that naturally grow, even non-native ones like English plantain, which support buckeye butterflies, a native butterfly that grows on a non-native plant. Don't tell the non-native plant that it's non-native. Maybe they'll stop. It's all about embracing these in the corners of your landscape. Are there places in your landscape that you could package away a place like this? Because this is where the majority of life is. Right now, if you go out and you want to listen for that droning of field crickets and things and field katydids, you go to those weedy ditches, roadside edges that are filled with this kind of vegetation. That sound is not in most people's garden. If it's not audible in your garden, you're doing something wrong because you don't have as much life as the weed edge does, right? So sometimes packaging these can be as simple as putting up a fence. You know, suddenly what wouldn't be so attractive is very attractive just because there's a split rail fence defining it, right? Whether it's in front of it, whether it's behind it, even just putting up something purposeful within a structured landscape can allow you to package away some of that. Okay, so let's look at truly Southeastern native, one example, and then we'll close up. So when you're creating a garden like we did at the South Carolina Botanical Garden, when I went to design these, I needed to look at those things we've already talked about, the geology, the soils, and the hydrology of the natural community I was interested in. In this example I'm giving you, I'm going to show you a longleaf pine sandhill community, okay? So this is the longleaf pine turkey oak sandhill community, if you want to really narrow or broad definition for the habitat. And you can see the structure of that community. When I go out there, I'm going to look at the soils. And this is number one thing is if you're not familiar with the community, how can you bring it into your yard? You can't do that. You have to go out and you have to learn in place. So you look at the soils, deep sands, droughty soils, low nutrient availability, acidic soils, right, in this habitat. You have to look at the geology that created it, the erosion of the Appalachian Mountains and the ocean 60 million years ago, right? Got it. The hydrology, we already said, extremely low water table. It's way down there, okay? So when we brought this into the garden, we didn't build a little one because the idea there was we wanted people to be immersed in the natural community, which meant I had to do things on this really grand scale so that you could walk into a room where you couldn't see out of that natural community. So this is the beginning of what I'll show you in just a minute. We had planted some longleaf pines out before we did the soil amendment, but you can see here we've got two types of communities we're putting in. We're putting in a scrub ridge community here, and we're putting in a longleaf pine sandhill all around here. So the first thing we did, brought in the right type of soil, okay? Did not need to line that. We just needed to bring in the right type of soil, make sure it was correct, let it settle, let it age a little bit. And this is the part people hate about this. If you're doing anything in the sunny habitat, you have to herbicide the place. You can try whatever you think is going to work, it ain't going to work. And restoration ecologists like myself, when we're trying to restore a prairie, unless you're going to restore this much at a time, you're going to have to absolutely nuke it before you start. That's just reality. So you nuke it, you let it set, you make sure the weed bank is down, at least the living weeds, you still have a seed bank. And then when we plant just as absolutely thick as we can afford to plant money-wise. If you're trying to establish one of these habitats and you have a weed bank down there, if you can't grow the native plants, which are generally slower and less adept at growing quickly than the weeds, it'll fail. So you can see I got probably 1,000 wiregrass plants out there, all placed about 18 inches off center. And then in between each one of those wiregrass, we put other species so that we had nothing with more than about 6 inches off center planted in the whole place. And if we had wet habitats within it, like this little perched depression pond we were trying to build, we were taking into account not just the soils, but also the hydrology, how we were building that into the site. So this is kind of what it looked like as we were planting it. And this is what it looks like now. And that was actually 1 year after doing the planting. Okay? So how close did I come to my goal? Pretty close. And what was great about the experiment that we did is when you duplicate all those things in nature, got so tired of people saying to me, oh, well, you can never really create a natural community. It's BS, you can. You can. It is functioning exactly like the natural community. So we have to take into account community composition of what you want to do. I already said, a great way to start learning is to read. So reading about not just the plants you love, but where they grow, what type of habitat they grow in, who they grow with, and what the community structure and conditions are like. So if you want to build a longleaf pine savanna because you love pitcher plants, but you don't want just to have a pitcher plant bog, you want to have the whole savanna, you want it to look more like this or this, well, we did. You can, right? You just follow the same recipe. And in this case, you have to make sure, just like in the prairie, right? These are both pictures from the garden, that we also introduce ecosystem process, which means burning, right? Or mowing. If you can't burn, there's really no substitute for burning. But if you can't burn, you mow. And this is 6 weeks after a fire at the South Carolina Botanical Garden at the same site. And this is in the autumn at the South Carolina Botanical Garden at the same site, right after that fire, right? So fire maintained community. This one, it was actually built on virgin prairie soils. We had a soft soil there, an alpha sol, a mollisol, that was created underneath the grassland. It was virgin because John C. Calhoun, who owned this property originally, grazed his cattle on this property instead of planting cotton, and so he never tilled the soil. When Thomas Green Clemson got a hold of it, he grazed his cattle on that property. When he donated it to the state, they put cattle on that property, and then they planted an orchard, an apple orchard on the property, but they never tilled the soil. So we have 4 feet of topsoil on this property, dark black topsoil that was created underneath grasses that had been growing there for thousands of years, that was supported by the indigenous traditional relationship with the land, which meant that Native Americans were burning it every year, which gave it a great grass cover that was very attractive to the Calhouns as grazing land, that was very attractive for us for putting a prairie back on, right? So we have a reconstruction here of what the early settlers, when they talk about big blue stem being so tall it was taller than their horse's head. Have you ever seen big blue stem as tall as the one I'm holding there? It's crazy, because we actually have all of the components that the ecosystem had to begin with present at the South Carolina Botanical Garden. And to do that, to replicate that without that virgin prairie soil would have been really difficult and very expensive, right? So when we made these changes, we did it not just to the native gardens, but we did it across the entire landscape of 295 acres. It was a major management decision to reduce our pesticide use so that we were just treating problems that were going to kill a plant that was very important, to make all the changes that we talked about in design and in management. And when we did that, we went from having 109 species of birds in the garden, and that was from 52 years worth of bird counts being done at the garden. We had 109 species. Within 10 years, we're up to 219 species today using the garden. We went from 8 frog and toad species to 18. We went from almost never seeing a frog to I've never been anywhere with more frogs. I've never been anywhere with more numbers, like density of birds, than the South Carolina Botanical Garden. And I take people all over the world to go bird watching. Never, ever have I seen the numbers of birds that are concentrated in this place. And just unbelievable blow up of insects. You know, and things like buckeye butterfly were only there because we embraced the ruderal component, right? Okay, so that's great. You're not a purist, you're not interested, you might be interested in trying building a natural community from North Carolina, but let's say you're not. This is a natural community garden too, right? It's planted the same way we just talked about. It's a natural community, but it's a natural community only because of the choices that people have made to create this uniquely human endeavor of gardening. The entire green world is a garden. Why did we have prairies in the Southeast? Why do we have longleaf pine savannas in the Southeast? Why do we have anything? Because of choices people have made in the past. Because of human management. I would challenge you to go somewhere in the world outside of Antarctica and find something that you can't see the hand of human beings in. it hit me very early on because I was one of these kids that grew up like completely hating human beings. My God, I'd walk down in the forest, my little route I made every day, and I'd see a Trillium undulatum that was displaced because somebody cut some firewood. And I'm like, oh my God, it's in the sunlight, it's going to die. Is how horrible. Human beings only make bad choices. And then I started working with a man named Richard Pochet, and he took me out to see sugar maples off of the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, off of Edisto Island, in the middle of the salt marsh. All those yellow things there are sugar maples. Sugar maples growing in a salt marsh, right? Maritime forest should be live oak, slash pine, Juniper silicicola, but not sugar maples. Why? Not because it's tropical and, deciduous trees don't grow there. That's not it. The reason sugar maples don't grow there is because those sands have not enough nutrients nor high enough pH to support the sugar maple, which dumps its leaves on the ground every year. This very special island with this ring of sugar maples, next to that ring you might notice there, and this ring you might notice over here, and actually there's a ring over here. Those sugar maples are growing on top of oyster shells, which does what? Calcium carbonate raises the pH of the soil, and suddenly you have sugar maples, Trillium, Spigelia, bloodroot, plants that grow nowhere else in South Carolina, things like Godfrey swamp privet, leafless swallowwort, shell midden morning glory, and they're only growing there because these islands are made up of oyster shells. And some of these places where you see a sugar maple growing are growing only because there's one little pile of oysters in the woods. And how do the oysters get there? Human beings. We don't know why they built them. If you want to get in a real argument, argue with an anthropologist or an archaeologist, because if you think gardeners are opinionated, you have no idea. And they're all right, everyone, no matter what the point of view. But this is the choice that somebody made 5,000 years ago during the late Archaic period to build Pig Island off of Edisto out of shell in a ring. They threw down a shell and they changed the world. This is a human gardening practice. Okay? It's a human manipulation of the environment. And because somebody chose to throw down a shell 5,000 years ago, they changed everything about the ecology of the low country of South Carolina 5,000 years into the future. And it's not reducing diversity, it's increasing diversity. We wouldn't have these plants there if they wasn't for the choice that somebody made to throw a shell down. And we wouldn't have the insects that depends on those plants. We wouldn't have the higher productivity of having the maples there. We wouldn't be producing more insects on this piece of land if human beings hadn't chosen to do a common thing that we all do, which is manage the world around us. And it's not really about whether or not we should do things on the land. It's about what our choices lead to. Are our choices building life? Or our choices decreasing life? It's a very beautiful thing in my tradition, which is called healing of the earth. It's a spiritual thing to come along. And it's about really working every generation one rung up a ladder to leave a world that's more closer to perfect than the one you came with. If we all made choices like this with our gardening, 5,000 years from now, the world would be a better place. So that's my talk. Any questions? Or do we have time for a question? I know I always go too long. Good? Okay. Absolutely. So let's say, so the question was, how do you work with an HOA to make sure that you're fitting into the regulations of a neighborhood while still adhering to the principles of having a garden that produces life? Okay.
Or office parks. Yeah.
Or office parks. Yeah, well, actually, office parks all over North America are changing to natural heritage gardens. That's a little different because virtually all the major campuses of the larger companies, because they are catering to millennial generation people that work there, they expect to have that kind of as a social expectation. So that's a little different. But even an office park. The picture I showed, one of the last pictures there of the Heronswood border, the front of the Woodland Garden, is structurally something anybody would love to see, right? An HOA is not going to be unhappy with giant cardiocrinums and, you know, masses of color along a border or a traditional English border garden. If you look at the structuring of the garden that I showed at Heronswood with this stream of Silene going through that beautiful traditional English border, but packed even tighter in the Great Dixter style, those are types of landscapes that you can do in your landscape to accommodate this without having to, you know, go out and carry drip torches and burn a longleaf pine savanna in your backyard. Y'all need one of these at Bristol Briar, though. I mean, that would be, you would definitely do it. Yeah. So there's definitely ways, and not everybody, you know, and it's the same thing. Human beings are human beings. This is something like the over the top recreation of a Chihuahuan desert is only something who's as ADD OCD as me would do. Okay, that's me. There's other of you out there who are just like me, but there's other of you out there who are like Dan Hinckley, right? Who would like to have that, but it can still be done by maximizing. That's why I spent the time at the early part of this, not just going over, hey, these are natural communities in the Southeast, but how does a natural community function, and how can we better duplicate that in our own gardens, regardless of the structure? So when that project started, my son and I went into the little stream bottom where we built the mountain and Piedmont forest exhibits, and we took out 19 giant dump trailer loads of privet, Japanese honeysuckle, silverthorn, all the things that grow in every woodlot everywhere, because that's all it was. My son and I put together the trail system, built it by hand. My son and I put up the little fencing that goes down there. My son and I planted the entire beds. It just so happened that worked out where we had high pH soil where I wanted high pH soil and acidic soil where I wanted acidic soil. We didn't have to do a whole lot other than bring in some of the rock types. But that first phase was basically my son and I trying to prove to the staff and to the world and to the university that we could do something like this and that actually people would come. When the first good year, about the second year in, that we had lots of flowering on that, it was 2012. We had lots of flowering on that, and people started to come from all over the place to see the Cove Forest exhibit. We sold it to the university to build the rest of the state. And at that point, we had lots of volunteer buy-in, and we had lots of buy-in from staff, and they actually increased the staff. So without the Natural Heritage Garden, we wouldn't have done what we're able to do. And it was everybody there working together that built that, not just me. It required lots of skilled labor and lots of labor, period. But without that, we wouldn't have made the transition. And the transition was we went from that $10,000 a year to $2 million a year. We went from having 4 to having 14 on the grounds. So, you know, it worked. The one beautiful thing about working for a university garden is you also have students you can take advantage of.
Oh.
Well, they learned a lot when they were working with me, but we did take advantage of it. You know, because it's, you know, you have work study, which we used tremendously, and then we also hired students outright, and, you know, we were forced to pay the minimum wage with the university. So we got a lot of really talented, good work out of them as well. Yeah, so one question she said was bothering her was about the sugar maples growing in the oyster shells is how long is this pile that's been around for thousands of years going to last? And the answer to that question depends on the choices that each of us make into the future, because that patch of oyster shells is much more susceptible and has been greatly damaged in just the past couple years by hurricanes that have come close to the coast, given that we've risen, the sea level has risen just a tiny amount over the last century, but that tiny amount is way more amplified when you have a 9-10 foot storm surge. So a lot of them are being destroyed. A lot of the sheltmans are being destroyed by boat wakes, boat traffic, and storm surge. And sea level rise, if things keep going the way they're going, will certainly overwhelm it sometime in the next 200 years anyway. Yep. So again, it's choices. The great thing about that last story, oftentimes you see these huge problems in the world and you think, how in the world are we ever going to solve them? And then you see how powerful throwing a shell down has been. And that's maybe one human throwing a shell down changes the world. So each of us can have a far outweighed impact on the future. And collectively, if enough of us are working that way, can really make a difference, right? Cindy, I'm sorry, you were...
Oh, I was just... the principles you taught.
Oh my goodness, yes. Yeah, I mean, again, even just planting containers, the same principles can be used there. And one of the coolest containers to plant is a bog garden, right? I mean, that's one of the coolest containers. And when you plant your bog garden, rather than just plant the pitcher plant, why not plant some companions that actually grow with the pitcher plants that support a community of insects? That will all get gobbled down by your pitcher plant, right? But no, I mean, that concept is still there. And I think that importantly for me, the one part about this is if you have a bog garden and you just grow the pitcher plant, you're not really understanding anything. But if you grow the things that grow with them, suddenly you see the deeper interconnections, whether it's changing the world around you, it's changing the world inside you by giving you a deeper understanding of how things really work if you were to visit a longleaf pine savanna in the Francis Marion National Forest. Right? Yeah, it bothers me too, because regardless of what they say, I can show you on the ground the difference between a garden in downtown Greenville and a garden that's just a few miles away that's outside the city limits. So the only difference is the pest control that's being applied in the neighborhood. So the biggest thing I think you can do is to make your opinion known, but then share with other people what that's actually doing and how to properly control mosquitoes more effectively without the use of weekly or biweekly spraying of everything. At the South Carolina Botanical Garden, I think we had 19 stagnant ponds. And we did not have a mosquito problem ever. We never sprayed for mosquitoes. We never did garlic sprays. We never did mosquito dunks. We had no mosquitoes, and we had standing water everywhere. And you went on moonlight light hikes during the heat of the summer. Nobody got bit by mosquitoes. Nobody needed mosquito spray. So what do? Well, we didn't manage our isolated wetlands as mow them to the edge or rock them around and keep everything from growing there and just have a few things. They were filled with vegetation. They were like a natural community themselves, which meant there's nowhere I've ever been where there were more dragonflies, damselflies, and predators than there. And a lot of the predators that consume pests in our garden, like lace bugs and the things that rack havoc on all these wonderful plants we've been talking about, if you don't have a ruderal component where those things can find a refuge during the year, they're not going to be in your garden either, right? We can easily wipe out lacewings very quickly from a garden, which are great predators to control problems in the garden by a simple one spray. So it's important to embrace that ruderal component on the corners of your design landscape so that you actually have a refuge for them. There's a study out of Michigan looked at this. It's like, I think it's $14 billion a year. It's a ridiculous number. Don't quote me on that, but you can look it up. That people in commercial agriculture in Michigan save every single year by providing feral, ruderal, weedy space between their row crops. So it can have a huge financial impact as well. There's one other thing I want to add here, which is that the other thing is I love native plants. I wish everybody well with native plants. And, for me, it's mostly native plants. However, my idea of what our native plant gardens need to be now is very different than what it was 25 years ago. Native plants are no more adapted to dealing with drought and poor nutrient, everything. There's the myth about native plants that if you just plant them, you don't have to do anything. Total garbage. All the pests that affect native plants are here because the plant is native here. So it's going to have more pests by default than a privet. That's why privet is a horrible invasive exotic, right? The other thing is, if you want it to look as good as a garden plant, you have to treat it the same way you treat a garden plant, which means it needs water when it's dry, right? Even in a natural community garden, we dump tons of water into the cove forest because it's drier today than it used to be. There used to be cove forest. We just plant it and walk away where we were at. We can barely grow hostas in Clemson, South Carolina now, but we can grow 26 species of palms, right? We got palmettos 25 feet tall, no problem now in Clemson. That wouldn't happen 25 years ago, right? And so looking to the future of how do we keep our native biodiversity around into the future is, for me, looking to the south and looking to the southwest of where we are here in the Piedmont. So really plants from Arizona, southeastern Arizona, southern New Mexico, Texas, and the Gulf Coastal Plain, the Atlantic Coastal Plain, are much better adapted to looking good right now in our habitats without additional water than plants that are actually native in your backyard. Okay? That's because climate change. Okay? I don't care whether you believe in it or not. It's hotter and drier than it used to be. Okay? It's warmer in the winter than it used to be.
So how does that work?
Yeah.
Is it helping?
Of course. I mean, having conifers isn't a bad thing. It's just if you have a conifer-dominated landscape.
Oh, I'm just going to put a few here and there.
Yeah. No, that's natural. That's great. That's beautiful. Okay. Some things that feed on hemlock. I mean, Canada hemlock's a native species in Wake County. And, there's native things that are going to feed on it there. That means there's native things going to feed on the Carolina hemlock too. But the big thing is if you dominate your landscape with ferns and conifers, then there's no way you're going to have as much productivity as if you had flowering plants, because they just don't have the nutrients in their foliage and they don't offer the nectar and the pollen that most things need.
So I could attract more things by having that diversity, even though that plant isn't as productive or as useful to as many species as an oak. Do the Dan Hinckley thing, right? Plant the conifer and then fill it with a vine that flowers, right? God, I love that about Heronswood. It's like all that diversity is on just a few acres. Now it's really only 4.5 acres of planted space. Yeah, and all that diversity is there because Dan made use not just of one plane, but all planes. It's a 3-dimensional garden where you have everything has vines growing on it. Everything has multiple times of the year that it's flowering, so that, we might have, like right in front of my office, we had this beautiful Stewartia. And it flowered in the fall, but all during the spring, there was a Clematis montana that was growing in it that turned the whole thing to this beautiful, lovely lilac color in the spring, followed by another Clematis that bloomed a little later, and then followed by the beautiful Stewartia blossoms. And then when the Stewartia blossoms were done, the Stewartia turns this brilliant orange in fall. You've covered all the growing season with color. And then in the winter, the beautiful bark on the Stewartia added even more interest. So it was year-round. And I think the more we think year-round, also the more things we're providing a resource for in that one spot. All right. Well, thank you guys very much. Go buy a book. Support that garden.
Go buy Patrick's book. If you want a crevice garden book, it's not too late. There's a few over there. See me or David White, the treasurer. And have a great day. Thanks.